Dile a ver si puede hablar a esa persona. Maja. No te oye.
Es de vuestra esa data. O sea, lo que se ha escuchado.
Escuchan en dos.
Vale. The title of the session is Fiscal Federalism, a Day on Diversity. We will have also two parts. Now we will have three presentations and the discussion, and then the coffee break, and again another three presentations and the discussion. Just one clear question before giving the word to Maria. Please, the discussion moment, the discussion period, if you ask something, present yourself and the center that you are coming from, because I can see that a lot of us we didn't know each other, don't know each other, and you have to know a little bit or very know each other. Without more presentation, it's the turn of Michael Sahati for presenting fiscal autonomy in the level governance, tracing effects on legitimacy and stability.
So, Maya, it's your turn, you can start. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I did not necessarily hear what you said, but I hope I heard that I should present at this point. Thank you. Very good afternoon from Antwerp. At this point, I'm very sorry that I cannot join as well, but I'll try to compensate some other time, I guess, next year. This is my first attempt to talk about fiscal autonomy and multi-level governance in a very specific way, sort of to say. So there are going to be some gaps, I believe. What I did is that I used the research from my previous work from a book that I published in 2020 on constitutional asymmetry, which is essentially a book on multi-level governance. And I used some of the elements as a basis. So, for example, I started with the premise that factors that mostly affect the multi-level system are political and social and economic, and then they're of course translated into some structural and fiscal framework, political and social into structural and economic into fiscal, and copying that we also see that there are some imbalances. Seeing structural imbalances in terms of structure, in terms of status or powers, but also supported through political parties as a concurrent feature. But also as a side question, I've been asking myself whether structural imbalances are irrelevant if they cannot be funded, and that actually brought me to the question of fiscal imbalances. What I did was I did a test throughout different systems in which I basically tried to figure out what would be the yardsticks that would point out the fiscal imbalances. And I came up with three, which does not necessarily mean that there are only those three, but those three were the most common ones, the most obvious ones. So I came up with fiscal power, which is a pretty good indicator of the level of autonomy, especially in multi-level systems incorporate some diversity, asymmetrical features as a consequence. So variations of any kind, because variations can pretty much determine the capacity to demand autonomy or to demand more autonomy. The second one was the harmonization of taxing powers, which I figured would be a very good indicator of the balance between horizontal and vertical levels in a multi-level system, especially if there are those variations, because variations, as you see on the slide, relatively easy put into play situations to achieve or maintain the power of the purse. And then the third one that I figured would be fiscal transfers, which I thought were a pretty good indicator of the extent of equalization among different levels in a multi-level system. And of course, they also indicate how centralized or decentralized the system is depending on how transfers perform or how they are performed. And then that led me sort of wealth as a common factor, as I've called it, because wealth, which is quite obvious, but I need to repeat it because it's part of the argument. We all know that unbalanced territorial distribution of wealth is actually the cause for discontent, and those levels that are wealthy, that are developed, will show discontent if their fiscal returns are not proportionate to their contribution, when they perceive their contribution to equalization as too high. But also on the contrary, we see that less wealthy levels will display discontent with their inferior position, especially if they're not able to meet their responsibilities. Or if they are even consequently forced to increase the levels of taxation. So in my mind, wealth actually highlights the variations between different levels, but it also affects equality, transparency, and cohesion, which are essentially, to cut the very long story short, I see equality and transparency as the basis for legitimacy, while cohesion is at the very core of the stability of the multi-level system, and that is how I argue on dynamic legitimacy and dynamic stability concepts in the book that I mentioned at the beginning. And so then I did a little bit more research and I did a test on equality. So what I figured is that, for example, unequal distribution of fiscal resources or maybe redistribution of transfers would necessarily cause very uneasy relations among resource-rich, taking into consideration wealth as a concrete factor. Especially when there is a question of matching revenues and expenditures, when we want to enhance fiscal equality, and then equalization strategies are directed towards counterbalance differences in wealth, and in both cases this causes equalization of unequals, which is not always meant positively, sort of to say. And then in transparency, I recognize that sometimes, or most of the time, in multi-level systems, there is a combination of fiscal rules that are applied at the same time, which for the end users creates a pretty complex picture to understand. Public scrutiny is also then under a question because fiscal structure is very difficult to be understood, but also how budgetary process is communicated transparently when it's complex, or that is also the question. What also often happens is that tax laws have very simplistic formulations, and that affects the implementation. So if there are several fiscal rules that are applied at the same time, that is a level of complexity that increases considerably. And then on this side, on the left side, so that is about equality and transparency, and then cohesion, which is essentially about unbalanced wealth and harmonization, and it's harmonization which is a reason for antagonism, especially in the cases if there is no balanced development among different levels, and especially in terms of solidarity and redistribution programs. Which kind of leads me to concluding remarks about this very dense presentation, that in terms of legitimacy, we see that, that the question of mutual legitimation is under the question when we talk about equalization, when we talk about differences in the allocation of funds. Because reaching the mutual consent, and now I go back to the beginning of the presentation when we talk about structural framework, when we talk about stages, when we talk about powers, when we talk about decision making, essentially, because wealthier entities may not be inclined to legitimize this, what they perceive as equalization of unequal or unequal redistribution of wealth, what they would perceive it that way. But also in terms of transparency, it seems that that would be a perceived unfair treatment which would lead to distrust. And finally, in the end, I think in terms of expenditures and harmonization, there would be an impact to institutional cohesion of the system. Because bargaining powers would also be affected. So that's what I have for now, and I will be joining a little bit later for the Q&A. I hope I match the expectations from the online presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Okay, we will continue now with Robert Williams from the Center for State Constitutional Studies that represents the presentation with the title Update in Comparative Subnational Constitutional Law.
Thank you very much. much. I'm Bob Williams here from New Jersey in the USA, and I want to apologize to you for submitting such a long paper. I know it took all of you an inordinate amount of time to go through my submission of one paragraph, so I apologize for that. But I wanted to introduce or update the study of comparative subnational constitutionalism very briefly, and then pass around a book for you to take a look at, and maybe just look quickly at the chapter for your country. But the study of federalism, to my mind, always includes two constitutional dimensions. And one of them is the national constitution, or federal constitution in federal countries, which gives us a sort of top-down look at federalism in each country that is organized under this arrangement or set of arrangements. But also there's a bottom-up perspective of studying the subnational constitutions adopted by the component units of the Federation. And I think most people know from most of the legal, political science, and historical consideration of comparative constitutional law, the focus has been dominated by the top-down study of the national constitutions, primarily to the exclusion of any careful look at the bottom-up view of, well, what do the constitutions of the component units actually look like? And this went on for many, many years, and it gave a little bit, I think, of a false view of comparative constitutional federalism, because looking solely at the national constitution or the federal constitution from this, what I call top-down view, makes it look like the constitutions of the component units are going to be pretty symmetrical. The authority coming down from a federation that's a devolutionary federalism is going to look pretty symmetrical. And even a coming together federation like the United States, whatever the provisions are in the national constitution, are going to look pretty symmetrical, it seems to me. But about 20 years ago, a few of us began to say, well, what if you really looked carefully at the constitutions of the component units and looked to see what the states, the cantons, the provinces, whatever they're called, what do they actually do with the authority they have from the national constitution? And we came up with a term, still top-down, looking at the national constitution, here's the term, subnational constitutional space. How much competency or space or authority does the national constitution either give or preserve for the constitutions of the component units? And I think in some ways, whether you're a lawyer, a law professor, a political science historian, an economist, looking at federalism has to take some account of the constitutional structures that are in place in a particular country. So the constitutional space, the top-down constitutional space, is like an accordion. It can start out pretty narrow. South Africa, very narrow, but it can expand, and it could contract again. And this comes either through amendments to the national constitution or decisions of the highest court. In the U.S., our subnational constitutional space the last few years has contracted and grown smaller dramatically through decisions of the United States Supreme Court. which have turned many of our state constitutional provisions on separation of government and religion. These decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court have turned those into waste paper. They're over, they're gone from the highest court. So when we started to look from the bottom up, we realized, there's actually quite a bit of asymmetry, where we, trying to stay on my time here. We look at, well, what do the component units actually do with the space that they are given, or the space that was preserved in a coming together federation? And we see a wide variation. And this study is really quite new, about 20 years old in the world so far. And so we see, for example, in South Africa, an actual no use at all by most of the provinces, other than the opposition province of KwaZulu-Natal and Western Cape province. But the rest of them have not, that hasn't changed, has it, Nico? Whereas in the United States, where we preserved subnational constitutional space when we came together, it's still pretty wide, but it can be narrowed by the Supreme Court or by amendments. But our Constitution is essentially unamendable these days. Some might disagree with that. But, as we see this accordion expand and contract at the top level, we also see the utilization of that authority, that competency that exists in the national constitution, change at this level of the component units. What do they actually do with this authority that's either left to them or granted to them? And one large preliminary conclusion we've reached is many of them underutilize this power that they have. They don't go to the limits of the varieties of kind of policies and structures and rights guarantees that they might provide at the subnational level. In the United States, we have 50 presidential systems, gubernatorial systems. We don't have a single parliamentary system. We actually could. Some state could decide to do that. We don't do it. I said South Africa, a number of the provinces haven't done a constitution at all. Haven't gotten around to it, primarily for political reasons. So when we looked at this bottom-up point of view, we involved people from around the world in federal countries and began with some conferences, a few publications and what have you. And the reason I wanted to give this update here is that there's a relatively new book out, a year and a half or so, that takes about 20 of the federal systems and uses a sort of a template to test a number of hypotheses about the extent to which component units of federations either have subnational constitutional space, not either, and if they haven't, what have they really done with it over time? And so this book, put together by Patricia Papiliera of Belgium, Giacomo Delladone of Italy, and Nicholas Aroni of Australia, it tests a number of hypotheses about subnational constitutions and reaches a number of important, although preliminary, conclusions about them, such as matters of the strength of the competence, one might say the width of the subnational constitutional space, how much authority do they have to make and change their state constitutions, subnational constitutions? Are there inclusion of subnational symbols, which I think has been a problem here in Spain and in Italy? in Spain in the autonomy statutes, they're not called constitutions, heaven forbid. The similarity of these subnational constitutions to the national constitution, there are a lot of similarities. Take the U.S. presidential system, gubernatorial system, no utilization of the range of authority. Might be a good idea, I don't know, but it's a fact. Together with inclusion of rights beyond what are in the national constitution. In the U.S. and in certain other countries, there are rights that inhabitants of the component unit have that are not recognized nationally. John Kincaid famously, or now it's famous that I'm repeating it, referred to these as peaks. I'm stopping now. Refer to this as peaks and valleys of rights within a country. And they tested the hypothesis about the availability of judicial review under the component unit constitutions. So with full disclosure, I wrote the foreword to this book, but I thought I would just pass it around. Please don't walk off with it. And you could just take a look. Is your country in here? Maybe you'd skim it. Maybe you'd order it for your library in behalf of these three authors. Thank you.
Okay, so just in time, we continue with the last presentation of this first part of the second session. We have Brian Phillips and Nicholas Hall from the Center for State Constitutional Studies and Key Project, and they present a presentation entitled State Constitutions in the American Federal Republic.
Well, thank you very much for having us. Oh, that's work. Good. Brilliant. Good. Okay. So we're going to tag team this. Sorry, we're both historians. This is a very historical approach to federalism. And basically two parts of the presentation. One part on the importance of state constitutional law in the US as well as federal constitutional law, and the second part about a particular methodological approach.
So,
Can you see?
I can, no, it's like a eye chart. I can't. It's fine. So we both come at this from obviously from a historical perspective, and that we sort of the starting premise is that as much as the conversation about constitutionalism and constitutional issues in the United States it tends to be framed around what is happening in the United States Supreme Court or what is happening in Washington for most of American history. Right? Most of America has an extremely vigorous constitutional history and a lot of constitutional activity going on. It's not happening at the federal level, right? It's not happening at the national level. It's happening at the state level. So we'll give you some things that I don't want to read from my PowerPoint slides, looking at that I'm part of the sin, but let's just throw out there between 1776 and 1861, right? There are 70 different constitutions that are in operation in American states. Right? This is before we consider the adoption of the Civil War and the adoption of the 14th Amendment, when things get more nationalized. Before that is going on, there's an enormous amount of energy being expended in creating governing documents in the states. This figure, and this is and even that figure, I think, which I think is large and impressive, doesn't include constitutions of states that are subsequently added to the Union. It doesn't include constitutions that are adopted by Native American indigenous tribes. It doesn't include conventions that are held to amend state constitutions, to add to them or rewrite them in some way, in some partial way. And it doesn't include state constitutions that are conventions that ultimately end in failure, right? It result in a document that isn't eventually adopted. When we get the total number, we're thinking about from 1776 until today, we get about 235 different successful attempts to rewrite governing documents in the several states of the American Union. So, I've established that there are a lot of them. People understand at some level that these are important, right? Justice Brennan, who's come up before today, in a different point in the discussion today, and who, like Bob Williams, who preceded us, writes a lot about, is like Bob and I, a jurist from New Jersey, right, the great state of New Jersey, who had come up through the state court system, is eventually on the state Supreme Court, is then nominated to a seat on the United States Supreme Court by President Dwight Eisenhower, arrives there at a moment when civil rights is an enormously important legislative and judicial activity in the United States, and is writing in the 1970s saying, look everybody, as much action as is going on at the federal level, ultimately the United States Constitution provides really a floor for how we should think about rights. If we want them extended and elaborated, and we want to find out, sort of get back to a more, I think, original understanding of what the role of state legislatures and state constitutions are in the Union, you want to look to state legislatures, you want to look to state documents as places where rights are elaborated, right? As places where rights, the U.S. the federal Constitution is a floor, but if you want to find new innovation that then can be nationalized, you want to be looking to the states and studying the states, right? So they're important. One of the favorite lines that I have from Justice Brennan here is that, right, the state constitutions are a font of individual liberties, right? They go beyond what's ultimately just required by law, and then, right, what is going on, the revolution that's going on in the civil rights movement isn't meant to squash or smother in any way the activity and vigor that can be found within state constitutional law, and how they should be understood. This is elaborated, right? This is elaborated by conservative judges on the federal bench for decades afterwards, right? That people understand at some level that there's a lot of activity that gets carried in. There's a lot of the people the framers who wrote the United States Constitution, the delegates at the Federal Convention in 1787, carried with them an understanding that there's a lot of that they were elaborating a tradition that had started in the American states after the Revolution, right? And so I love stuff like this, right? Historians, this gets me very excited that before the convention, before the 1787 convention, that you can find collected volumes that we can presume that every member of the Federal Convention probably had come across at some point a collected volume of the constitutions that are written by the 13 American colonies turned states in the immediate aftermath of the Declaration of Independence, right? When they were advised by the Continental Congress that in order to have legitimacy in how they governed, it was in the interest of colonial, now state legislatures to rewrite their governing charters. A lot of them just, right, they crossed out every reference to the king. New Jersey basically did this, crossed out every reference to the king, writing the people, and keep the document pretty much as is. Some of them did much more. Some of them were much more imaginative than that. But they all did this sort of basic exercise in making themselves sovereign, right? And so there are numerous volumes that are in circulation before 1787 that are collections of these documents, right? There's already an understanding that there's an elaborating American constitutional tradition that is being brought into the Convention of 1787. So when we ask ourselves, what is being constituted in the Convention, right? What is being constituted in the United States Constitution? They are harnessing some of this energy and trying to even out the different aspects of these documents that are enforced and in some places in conflict, right? Let's go. Did I? Yeah. Okay. Oh, here. Yeah, sorry. Okay. So the next one. Thank you. So the trouble is that this is a English tradition, but it's not at all consistent, right? If we want to understand it as a system, if we want to think about come up with any kind of coherent definition of what federalism is in the American context, this can be confusing because 50 different state Supreme Courts make decisions about how to interpret their governing documents 50 different ways, at least 30 different ways, and there's no uniformity in how this is done, right? So what we find is the United States Supreme Court notices this, right? And the United States Supreme Court says, by the way, guys, this is fine. If you don't want to do this uniformly, we're not going to require it because that's sort of the great, let's see throw everything out there and see what happens, right? There's a general principle that states are independent and have sovereignty. But the ultimate upshot of this is that there's no guiding principle on how state courts and state legislatures are supposed to govern their own governing documents. They're supposed to interpret their own governing documents. So we have, just to give you a couple examples. Delaware says that, it's an indivisible federal, Delaware court, state Supreme Court, says that, Delaware, tiny little Delaware, home of Joe Biden, is an indivisible, it's in this indivisible federal unit, but Delaware gets to do its own thing, right? If we look at New Hampshire, tiny little New Hampshire, tax-free state where people go buy alcohol, if you're from Massachusetts, same thing, right? We're interpret this in our own distinctive way. Texas also has the same underlying principle, right? It insults the dignity of the state charter and denies the citizens' protection of rights if they interpret it in light of what the federal Constitution says. Right? What we find early on, let's go back one, right? Sorry. Yeah. So we go back, though, to 1819, a really important case. There has always been at the heart of American constitutionalism an idea, at least at the federal judicial level, that there should be some kind of methodological coherence in how this shouldn't just be simply results-oriented. Right? There should be, in America, there should be a methodological coherence in how this is done. So,
Let's skip.
go to him.
Okay, very, very quickly. There's an archival problem in America. The negotiations that create the state constitutions are very, very complicated. Hundreds of years of scholarship on the Federal Convention, or 120 years, we still don't have agreement about exactly what happened there. The processes at state level are even more confusing as processes and as discussions. And the kinds of documents that we have to study these texts and their creation are of two kinds of characters. One, they're designed for the people in the room to conduct the discussion, and two, they're designed for memorialization. But the people they're not designed for are subsequent commentators to really make sense of those texts. And that leads to a series of interpretive challenges that are really difficult. And this is compounded by the fact that even the archival work, the basic archival work that you think might have been done about state constitutional text, simply hasn't been done. So our solution to this is to say, well, we need to do something to break the logjam here. And there's an initial article on the digital platform we've developed, which is up here, but essentially using a digital platform to try and make sense of and enable comparative work on these state constitutional conventions through a series of visualizations, which I don't have time to explain, but which the article does, that let you track the way text is evolving in a constantly evolving document, the contributions of particular individuals, what we know about the sources, what we don't know about the sources, and also to start to track language across time and place between different constitutional conventions, because often they're in dialogue with each other, both within a nation and internationally. In order to try and do this work, we've adopted a federal approach ourselves. The digital platform is designed really in Oxford, but we've worked with mostly undergraduate researchers to do archival work, digitization, transcription, help with digital editions, help to create the models, and also a little bit with dissemination. These are some students working with us. These are some of the institutions who work with us. And I should say that these are mostly non-traditional students. This is a great project for non-traditional students getting into archives, and they've done work that's been cited at state supreme courts. This was Brian's student group in Oxford. And if you want to look at the digital platform, you can find it here. And that's our time. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Ituna from the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. My question also relates to subnational constitutions. You made reference to the fact that despite the fact that there is a constitutional space for subnational governments to exercise their competence, there is often reluctance to fully exploit that constitutional space. From your research, what are some of the reasons why there is that reluctance to fully exploit this constitutional space? In the South African case, I think you already mentioned quite well that maybe most of the main reason is political reason, the fact that we have got a one party that dominates the federal as well as the subnational. And then this is one of the reasons why the subnational states are reluctant to fully exploit. So I'm eager to hear what you find out from other countries. Thank you.
Thanks. Nico Straker from the Donna Omar Institute, Cape Town. Just to bring fiscal federalism together with subnational constitutions, there seems to be a bit of a gap here. One of the reasons why South Africa is very uninventive for new structures of government in provincial constitution is the provision in the constitution which says if you construct a new institution outside the blueprint provided by the national constitution, you will pay for it. So there's a deep fiscal provision in it. And even if you don't have such a provision in the Constitution, it may well be the underlying motive. You can't go and have a second chamber in a state constitution. I know in the US there are plenty of them, but in other cases, you will pay for it. So the constraints, there are fiscal constraints, and perhaps, Rob, you can say a few things about, it's not politics, it is a nice link between state constitutions and fiscal federalism. Thanks.
We can stop this now.
Excuse me. I don't think it's only coming together federations that utilize subnational constitutions or provide space for them, but I do think, and I'm far from an expert on Nigeria, but I've known for some time the decision was made not to authorize subnational constitutions. I was going to try to find it at lunch and make sure I was right about this, but I got sidetracked by these guys. But so what you said was that the states of Nigeria do not have their own constitutions. I don't know the reason for that, but and you might let us know in response. But that's a legitimate decision for a federal country to say we're not going to have these subnational constitutions. We're going to have other ways of structuring relationships between the component units and the federation. But there are a number of devolutionary federal systems that do have this accordion-like definition of subnational constitutional space in their national constitution. The general lesson we've learned, though, is that they tend to be less tolerant. The devolutionary federations, which can decide, or we're giving back, we're devolving some authority, a variety of things, maybe a list of shared competencies, maybe a list of exclusive competencies for the component unit, and maybe we'll let them have their own constitutions too, but let's not let them do too much. Just the political and structural calculations in that kind of an operation, it makes sense that there will be a narrower constitutional space in a situation like that. By contrast to where the formerly independent units come together and create this limited national government. Of course, our founders thought we were creating a limited national government that's gotten pretty powerful over the years, partly through, as Wes said, the advent of the federal income tax. But so I'm actually curious about the reason, but the decision in Nigeria not to have component unit constitutions predated the 1993 Constitution? I think. Is that so? Have the Nigerian Constitution, states ever had their own constitutions?
They used to, and that died with the coming of the military in 1966. And that explains why the Nigerian system is theoretically, it's opposite to what we read in the literature. And that's why people are clamoring for a reform.
I think there's an interesting point here, if I may suggest. If you had asked an advisor from the United States in the 1990s, I don't know if Nigeria did, might have done, should we bother with state constitutions most advisors would probably have said, those state constitutions all look pretty similar, because state constitutional government at a high level looks very similar. And it was a huge surprise to me. I worked on the federal constitution for about 15 years before I started looking at state constitutional conventions, and I didn't expect them to be so exciting, because I'd actually also bought into the idea that most state constitutions look very similar in the US case within very broad limits. And it's not until you go into the detail of the debates and discussions at state level that you realize that there's a profound disagreement about the kinds of rights that should be protected and how they should be protected and how government should operate. But I think this is not well understood even in America. And so it doesn't surprise me in a way that even states emulating, I think you said in your talk, there's a sort of conscious emulation of America, might think, well, at state level, we don't necessarily need to worry too much about subnational constitutions, because although the Americans have messed around with their state constitutions, at some level they all look pretty similar. It's not until you get into detail that you really realize that's not true, but even the American legal profession is only now, in the 2020s, coming to fully understand that point.
I think that's a terrific point. But there are other reasons too. I think that if I understand the South African situation, originally the African National Congress didn't want a federal system at all. It was the F word, I think. I couldn't use it. And ultimately, a compromise had to be hammered out. But then first it was like, well, we didn't ever believe in federalism. Why, since the ANC controlled all but the one province back at the beginning, it was, we don't want you to draft your own constitution. And I think KwaZulu-Natal did it as an expression of opposition politics together with a lot of local concerns that they had there. But then I think as well, it was the new South Africa had a heck of a lot of things to work on. And the idea that you'd spend your time drafting a provincial constitution within this pretty narrow space anyway was, we got a lot more important things to be doing. I have to say, we did it during our Revolutionary War, during the war. So that was a very important job for us, I think, too. But there must be a lot more to this, but again, this is a fairly new study. But the next question was, why do we have this underutilization, I think. And I think there are a couple of reasons. One is political. If the story in South Africa there was that the provincial governments were also ANC, and the national ANC was saying don't do provincial constitutions. Pretty simple. But there's also a force of habit. I think Americans would say, why would we have a parliamentary system in our state? I think with the kind of gridlock we have in our country, we might start to move to think about that. But it's just not thought of in our context. It's not thought of as American. I mean, we have a separately elected executive who represents the whole, at the national level, the whole country, sort of. But at the state level, the governor is represents the whole subnational polity. And that's the way it's been. So there's a term for this, I can't remember it. It's why typewriter keyboards were never changed. Yeah. What is it?
Path dependence.
Yeah, path dependence. Just force of habit. It's too hard to do something different. One thing, at least, and this is different in the different subnational units, do the people vote on changes? How much space is there for popular sovereignty in a number of ways? But certainly, if you're going to change the Constitution, the people vote on it. Not true in all countries, because they're subnational constitutions. decisions. Lots of countries, the parliament can do it. Might have to go through some extra steps. I bet you, if an American state proposed a parliamentary system, it'd be voted down. People go, hey, what is that? We don't understand that. We couldn't even get the metric system through our country.
I think there's just a small point to add there as well, which is in very few federal systems other than the US, is there such a clear confusion about where sovereignty really lies. And that in most federal systems there are much clearer answers to the question of sovereignty, whereas even the individual states in America can't agree how genuinely sovereign they are, as Brian put in his slides. And that creates a very dynamic discussion in the United States that it would be very hard to replicate elsewhere, except at times of great constitutional stress. We're beginning to have that question about sovereignty in the UK, vis-a-vis whether Scotland can vote for independence or not. The law says no without everybody else's agreement, but they want to anyway. I know there are other areas of Europe where this is also an issue. So these issues can occur, but in the US it's particularly clear that the question of sovereignty is unresolved.
Very interesting. Just one more. We have some time. We don't, in the U.S., we don't have state political parties. And this is more and more true. The political agenda in the states is the political agenda at the national level. So at the national level, nobody is interested in trying to figure out new kinds of structures for the states. They either want to outlaw abortion or make abortion legal, or they either want to cut down financial support and military support in Ukraine or not. And that passes directly down to the states. There's very little, I'm overstating it, but there's very little appetite for state-centered innovation. It does exist, but and Nick's point about sovereignty really became, in the context of most of the discussions today, in the pandemic, where, and even within the states, because the governors taking emergency measures, and could the legislature counteract those and things like that. But it was also, is this a federal problem or a state problem? And I don't think we've figured that out yet. Nico's point, I didn't know that actually, thank you. But it's quite understood in the U.S. system that there's some innovative kind of structure. It's certainly going to be the state's responsibility to pay for it. And there's a very interesting, it's not new, but a very interesting phenomenon that's taken place we don't have it at the federal level, but at the state level, the creation of what Muslims call constitutional agencies. So I grew up in Florida, and if you wanted to know if you could hunt on Sunday, you didn't look at the law. You looked at the administrative regulations of the constitutionally created Game and Fish Commission, which was created in the state constitution to regulate hunting and freshwater fishing. In Florida, we didn't regulate saltwater fishing because that was tourism. We didn't, but freshwater fishing was highly regulated, and hunting was highly regulated, but not by the lawmaking body, by this structure that it didn't fit legislative, judicial, or executive. It was a blending of that. And the most recent example is kind of a fun story. In Montana, there, the United States, the other main issue coming down from the national parties is gun regulation, and now coming from the Supreme Court. In Montana, the state university system said, enacted a administrative rule saying you can't bring firearms onto university campuses. And the state legislature, under the domination of the national political party, passed a law saying you can bring firearms. I mean, I'm a liberal Democrat. There's a way to know that. It's preposterous. But that's what they said. And so that went to the state Supreme Court. And the answer was the university gets to decide because it's a constitutionally created agency in the Montana Constitution. And great surprise to people, particularly the state legislature in Montana. They thought, hey, we can control the state university. No, it was set off from the regular lawmaking functions in the state constitution. So these kinds of innovations do go on a fair amount. Probably that question in Montana is going to go to the federal courts because we're not sure the federal Second Amendment will allow universities to not permit firearms. But it's really very complicated, as Luke says. But,
if you look at one of the differing results there, because in the cases of states, some state constitutions allow for, like New Jersey, there's a rigorous administrative review process at the state bench, the state judiciary, right? It's a completely different standard than the federal one for rulemaking, and forcing agencies like administrative agencies to make a case for why a particular rule should be enforced. And so citizens in different states have wildly differing standing to be able to make demands on the state to demonstrate why its own rulemaking process should stand. Right? And by contrast, there are certain agencies that are completely out of touch. So it makes it very, from a democratic accountability standpoint, it can be incredibly difficult across the union to try to figure out who's to credit or who's to blame for any particular decisions that are being made, or to be able to hold anyone accountable for decisions that are very unpopular. Right? There are a lot of things that are sort of taken out of the realm of ordinary electoral politics and placed within a sort of a more rarefied sphere of rulemaking, in the way that the Supreme Court seems this body of nine wizards who hand down rules until for the rest of their lifespans. When in reality, until like but until fairly recently, that was just not the view of how courts operated. People saw them as extensions of what, if you look at a more early American understanding of what the court is, people did not have reverence for the court in the way that people in your profession almost have. Personally, sure, but sort of the reverence, the reverent understanding of judges as being above day-to-day politics and not being results-oriented. That's a much more modern development that's coincided with a much more aggressive use of federal review power against states.
And I think what happened is understanding this sort of welter of differences at the component unit level. You at some point when you're looking at federalism, you start to say, if you look just at the United States Constitution, you would have no idea this was going on in the states. Federal Constitution, it mentions state constitutions in a few places, but it doesn't say what should go on with American state constitutions. It led a few of us to start saying, I wonder what goes on in Switzerland like this. I wonder what goes on in South Africa like this. Germany, Nigeria. Oops, no constitutions, but still, I've got a lot of difference. And that's what the new book tries to start to regularize, to start to say, well, there really is a way to think about the width of the state constitutional space. There really is a way to think about the power of component, and to compare the power of component units to utilize these kinds of things. And I hope that book will stimulate, a continuing bottom-up sort of study of this, until recently sort of hidden, fascinating complexity and opportunity for policy making and innovations in government structure, hopefully for the benefit of the people.
We have the last 4 or 5 minutes, maybe one more question, or we close the U.S. Constitution table. Okay. Last chance. Okay, we will have now a brief coffee break, 20-25 minutes. Please, 4:30, 4:35, be here at the one we need to start just on time, then not to be hurried or going to the city hall. Okay, sorry, the coffee break. This is the coffee break is in the second floor. Okay, we have to go upstairs. No, we have the coffee break.
But it's sometimes
No question. You don't want to push it to the wall. Once you keep 40 years, you don't have to stick to it. One was an undergraduate fine arts major. She graduated in college with lead singing, rock and music. She put her first case she ever did was an arbitration. The arbitrator was Archibald. No, my first public
Yes, that was the vice president.
She's 40 years, she's doing still. She's some good.
Yes, and
She realized though that
no problem.
she was out 5 years before.
Complete legal procedure.
LSAT. She said he was good.
Oh, sure. Let's do,
Going down the first
I have lost
No, just kidding, I'm just curious.
That means very, very brief.
No, I just wondered.
Yes, sure.
oh dear.
They have a schedule of 20 minutes. Okay? It's 5 minutes for the celebration, and then we will go 15 minutes to give the most important messages. It's crazy. Yeah. I think I will leave now for the article. So, very confident myself. Yes, too much lunch. I'm not used to that. It was just too much. So, I tried to do better in the morning. And I'll meet you again at the City Hall. I hope it doesn't have too much doors. I am here. So, das ist genau das, was ich gerade frage. Jetzt also mehr Luft wenigstens. Ja. Ganz kurz und dann morgen haben wir ja, ihr seid um 10. Ja. Wer ist denn für den nächsten Wort vorgesehen, Präsidenten? Ich. Ah, super, das finde ich gut. Das stimmt. Das stört mich gar nicht. Ich sage halt, das endlich mal eine Frau. Na, und wer sonst noch drin? Ja, ist gut. Mach das, dann gibt's die Bälle. Ja, das ist sehr gut. Oh, ja, wir haben ja 2 Grad. Wer kannst die Konten nicht dauernd wechseln? Nein? Yo, ahora soy por la pilla.
Sí, sí.
Miguel Ángel.
No. Es una prueba para saber quién es el
Ah, vale.
Antes de...
Oye, vamos a para echarle ya
Yo no sé nada, es una vaga que no me entiendo. Ha sido los 20 minutos que hemos pasado es crítica, pero soy
echa una nota que tu diccionario.
eso cuenta con notables.
Ellos no solo cuando pago 8,5. Vale, esango 10 igual.
Visita ezagutu da ditzekoak, istudia okultarekin egite laguntu dezakegu, que siempre mucho ya desea.
Sí, la verdad, un poquito.
Vale, es todo igual.
Este se ve muy de ahora, la verdad, un poquito sobre las cosas.
¿Qué pasa en esta cosa?
Te igual hago en el libro de la vista, te mucho de la hotel épico, se ve distinto uso, eso es la unidad, no solo tiene...
Sí, es verdad.
Ropas en contratando igual.
Avanza la suave,
No, pero Beraiek.
Vale, niña, ahora nos desmarcamos más, tío, importa poco. Yo acabo de volver a la derecha,
Hori duka maztan jaztenako. Sabes, justo serio, ¿sabes? Me quedo bueno, vaya, está jatuko, izan ez da jaten. Sabes, simplemente, soy la cosa y me carga parte bat.
Bela, bat, eta oso oso.
en la parte buena.
Está jatuko, simplemente la puta cara, la haces justo, lo cosarías como lo mismo, esa movida, y luego de tiempo grato,
Nos ponemos en mano, esto tema... Y se le declara, o sea, me mete de camisa de usos, esto soy.
es el portugués es un día de esa manera.
Ya, baina, enola dakit.
Oye, oso,
Hoy siendo socio.
Bian, halako zinekin zuen joan, bian egun bardak, pero bai, amarradan, eta baroja bai da loko, buelta dizera.
Era el mismo año.
Vale, gero
Con el libro de la materia no la prueba ahí.
vale, bila baroja behar dugu, amarratatik, zabalik, interneta eta balioko kontzertuak.
Mañana vamos a hacer pruebas. O sea, yo
Eta amarratan da, ez da, bat etortzo sortzateetan da.
bueno, no sé si no son las cosas que mañana
Horario da, Gero zure gure presa.
bueno, igual la sidera es. Vale, yo soy de David, de Burgo por el 15, digo yo no la de por aquí.
Ano goaz, no? Gero digo da mucho.
Vale, pues no sé qué.
Orduan hori ondo, orduan gero bihar zuzeko bat, una cosa hemen, amarrero kontsumitz, ino, amarretan, exekutitu bakan eta sortzikatzen da. Onaldo zera,
Pues directos, hicimos de la amarga.
pentsatzen hau, directos gehiago, amagozten dira, bai? Pentsatzen da bilena da, exekutuzera, ez, amarretan batzen dira aurtean. Zaten dira, no, a ver,
Sí, pero este guión se está posicionando en tu página de buscarlo. Si te va a dejar
I warned Rajan that we are in our session is 16, but I'm afraid that you see he did not see the messages. I am afraid that the Senate session of the university is still ongoing, so it means that probably I will be alone.
yes,
But let's say,
we prefer that only USB if it's possible.
all right, all right. Yeah, technical, yeah, all right.
Please,
All right, yeah,
tiene contraseñas. Bueno, ¿qué importa? Se va a cambiar.
So your co-authors are coming down? Sorry? Your co-authors are coming. I'll go. There was theoretical chance for him to be online because he became dean of faculty of philosophy less than
At your university or?
University of Mostar less than a month ago.
Okay.
So he's in crazy house now. The end of his mandate, first time he's very young. He's less than 40 years old.
Okay. Oh yes, dean already.
Yeah, already dean of the faculty. And faculty of philosophy is huge. Well, we have no faculty of philology, which means that all language groups are there.
They are there as well.
Languages and literature. And together with all social sciences, humanities.
Oh yeah.
Yo no le veo ningún problema. Ese es, pero cuando se gana, oye, hermano, yo no lo oigo, yo no salgo.
More entertaining. It's already 4:45.
Yes, that is right. You have 10 minutes.
That is
Well, I think that maybe we will start just to play the ending of the session. We continue now with the second session, as I told you before, Fiscal Federalism at Dayton University, and Andrea Filippetti from the Institute for the Study of Regionalism, Federalism and Self-Government. We'll start with the presentation titled The Italian Constitutional Court Decision and State-Region Conflicts in the Pendulum of Regionalism, and its continuity, design, approach. It's your turn.
Okay, thank you. Nice to be here again. So if you think about the IACFS conferences, that you get so many interesting insights that you always drive to your next year paper during the conference. And in fact, this paper, first draft, I wrote it during last year's presentation of our Spanish colleague about the Spanish Constitutional Court. Okay, it's a joint paper with Provincial and a colleague of us. We are economists, so we use numbers, but I would refrain in this case, promise. The paper is something which is close to what we've seen this morning about what is the role of federal states or central governments during crisis. How do they decentralize power? How do they decentralize fiscal autonomy? And during crisis, exogenous shocks, like pandemic or like great recessions. In our case, actually, our question is not really what the central governments did during the crisis. I will show you which crisis I'm talking about, but mostly what the Constitutional Court did. Okay? So the framework is that of a recentralization process, which took place in Italy after 2011, but the aim is to explore how the Constitutional Court was behaving during the recentralization process. So there's something that we call the pendulum of regionalism in Italy, which is very much this idea that starting from the late 90s and then with the reform of the Constitution in 2001, there was a big push towards regionalism, devolution, fiscal autonomy, and fiscal federalism. Okay? So the pendulum was very much swinging versus regionalism, more with the autonomy of regions and subnational governments. Then 2011, we have the Great Recession, and then in Europe we had the sovereign debt crisis, and in Italy there was this strong re-centralization process. So the central governments, those days was we call them technical governments, okay, so it was run by Professor Mario Monti. He started a process of re-centralizing. So the central government was taking back, in several cases, fiscal autonomy, legislative power, and this actually was following on the European Union that was passing the six-pack provision, which was basically tightening the fiscal budgets of the countries. So it's a situation in which you have late 90s, early 2000s, regionalism, let's say, has been seen as a part of a general modernization of the Italian public administration. Okay? So devolution was seen as a part of a broader process that actually involves the whole administrative setup of the Italian state. Okay? And what I want to emphasize here is that there was a sort of consensus among political parties, but also among population. It was very sort of federal spirit, in a sense, okay? So there was in the country consensus about regionalism being one of the key reforms to make the country more efficient, okay? This changes very much in 2011. Actually, regional autonomy now is depicted as the main culprit, okay? So the problem of the Italian budget is too much autonomy to the regions, okay? Especially in terms of fiscal federalism, but also legislative power. And so now there's quite a big shift in the institutions, in the governments, among the parties, that they went too far. So the pendulum had to be brought back towards more unitary setup. Okay, so that's our framework, and our question is, what was the role of the court in this re-centralization process? Was it neutral? Was it pushing? Was it, how has the court behaved? So the research question is that we propose something that we define institutionally embeddedness of the court. The idea was that it's not that the court is the agent of the central government. It's more in line with those literatures which goes back to Robert Dahl, according to which courts, even though they are not agents of federal governments or central governments, they are embedded in the institutional the sentiment of the country. And so, in a sense, they are also, let's say, they're not natural, so they would accommodate, okay, what is the sentiment of the institutions, of the political parties, of the country, the majority, in some historical moments. And so that is also our hypothesis. So, what do we do to test this hypothesis? What we do, we take the disputes between the state and the regions, okay, central government and the regions, between 2006 and 2007. So those are all the judgments, okay, from the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, in which there is a dispute between state and regions, central governments and the regions. Well, as you can see, there is some sort of dynamic of total conflict. The state is very much prevailing more than the regions. These figures are very much similar to what you see in Spain, for example. So those are not federal countries; those are unitary countries. So the state tends to prevail over regions, but you have some dynamic here, which also you can see that 2011 onwards you have a new rise of conflicts. I will now be more specific about it. So the data we use are just disputes among governments and regions. Those are the disputes in financial matters. And as you can see, by 2011, when the crisis steps in, when the government decentralizes, the disputes in financial matters start becoming more relevant. So regions and the state delegate more on these topics as expected. Okay. We also have disputes by different topics. So subsidiarity, fiscal autonomy, residual competencies, public finance, and so on and so forth. So for each topic, you have the blue bar is the total of disputes, the red bar is the disputes won by the regions. Okay? So you see where most of the disputes take place, and you see that the state is prevailing, sometimes two-thirds of the cases on average, the state is prevailing. Okay, so our empirical analysis, I'm not showing numbers, but I'm just give you the flavor of what we find. So it's an econometric analysis which basically, so we control for a number of factors, okay? The factors that the region is from the south or the north, the income of the region, the year, so on and so forth. Once you control for all these factors, what you have is that after 2011, the probability of the region to prevail is lower than 16%. Okay? So there's a sort of, we show it graphically. What you see here is the probability of the region to prevail over a dispute against the state. Okay? And after 2011, when the state is recentralizing, this probability goes down by 16%. Okay? So, 1 minute more, just the conclusion. What we show is that after 2011, when the state is recentralizing, the Supreme Court, it's not that it's changing its behavior. Let's say it's being more kind to the state. Okay, it's helping this pendulum to go back. Okay, by providing a 60% increase to the state of prevail in its disputes. I'm also, pointing out some limitations of the analysis. When you do empirical analysis, look at the quantity, not the quality. And we know that the objections from constitutional lawyers that where there are disputes which are very, very important, are that are not. So how you take this into account? We do not. Okay. There's also this second element of, criticizing, which can be, the court has always been in favor of central government, which is true on average, but it's also true from our data that we do find some, some change in the reality, which suggests that the court is, facilitating this process of decentralization in Italy when the state is getting back some power from subnational level governments. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to talk about unequal permanent austerity and the distribution of power in the Canadian Federation. My objective is to explain the causes and consequences of this graph in particular, which is a projection of net debt in the Canadian provinces compared to the central government over the next 30 years. And this is a projection that exists among many institutions, so this is pretty much consensual. So what we're seeing is that the dark line is the federal government's debt, which tends towards zero over the long term, whereas the province's debt tends towards 70% of GDP, making the Canadian provinces the most indebted subnational jurisdiction in the world. So what are the causes of these trends, and what are their consequences in terms of the distribution of power in the Canadian Federation? That's the question I'm asking right now. And I'm using an argument that is building on some studies in comparative political economy. And I think that this can be some form of fruitful dialogue between comparative political economy and the study of federalism. So this is what I'm trying to bring in this paper. So my argument is that these trends are caused by unequal permanent austerity, which means that the pressures of permanent austerity are unequally distributed between the provinces and the federal government in Canada. So what's the concept of permanent austerity? This is derived from Paul Pearson. It has three components. And this touches to all of the advanced democracies in the world. But very few people have shown that it may be unequal between subnational and central governments. So in permanent austerity, you have endogenous pressures. This is the maturation of welfare state commitment, population aging, slower growth, that meets the immovable object of the welfare state, meaning that although you have these endogenous pressures that increase the size of the state and the economy, it is very difficult for government to reduce expenditures because existing programs create feedback effect. They create constituencies that defend the existing programs against cutbacks. And at the same time, governments are facing a situation of a decline of the taxability of societies, so they cannot easily raise revenues to deal with these raising expenditures. And so we are in a situation of permanent austerity where government has a reduced fiscal room to maneuver. And I'm going to show that these pressures apply to the provinces much more than to the federal government. So, unequal endogenous pressures. First, provinces are service heavy, whereas the federal government is transfer heavy. So about 70% of expenditures at the federal level are transfers. And services, the cost of services are much more likely to grow over time than the cost of transfers. So labor costs, for example, for services are more likely to grow, whereas transfers, you can control the cost of transfers. And also, the effect of population aging is totally unequal between the federal government and the provinces, because population aging increases health expenditures, which are provincial responsibility. And for example, health expenditure are so important for provinces' public finance that if you increase the inflation of cost of healthcare from 1% to 1.5%, provinces' net debt in 2050 will be 87% of GDP, in contrast to an increase of 1% of health expenditures, which leads to a net debt of 67% of GDP. Population aging does influence pensions, which is a federal responsibility, mostly in Canada, but in Canada, pensions are pretty cheap. Most of at least half of the pension expenditures are private expenditures. So the fact that pensions are federal is not a problem for the federal government. The cost of pension is sustainable over the long run. So population aging affects healthcare costs, which is a provincial problem. What I show in this paper is that the provincial and federal government have unequal retrenchment capacities. The provinces are unable to do very large fiscal consolidations, cannot do austerity as much as the federal government. So services are more difficult to retrench than transfers because services are given by providers. These providers are able to form interest groups and to block the retrenchment of services much more than recipient of transfers. Moreover, a large part of federal transfers are transfers to provinces. Intergovernmental transfers are relatively easy to cut back because people cannot attribute blame for these cutbacks. And actually, the federal government has been able to reduce transfers to provinces by a third in 1 year, which is quite impressive. You cannot really imagine the government being able to reduce services by a third in 1 year. And in other articles, I've shown that governments are quite responsive to public opinion, even when they implement austerity measures. And provinces have the most popular programs by far. This is what this data is showing. I can show many data that show that healthcare and education, which are provincial responsibility, are extremely popular. So most people want more spending for healthcare and education. Very few people want less spending in healthcare and education. Whereas these programs on the right that are the federal government responsibility are much less popular. Yes, pensions are popular, but unemployment insurance, since it is means tested in Canada, it's mostly for the poor, it's not popular at all. There's only 24% of the population that wants more spending. Almost as many people want less spending in unemployment insurance. So it has been easy for the federal government to reduce spending in unemployment insurance to deal with the pressures of permanent austerity. And so this is what I'm showing also in this paper is that the fiscal consolidations at the provincial level are much smaller than the fiscal consolidation at the federal level, and I argue that this is because the nature of the program is different. That's what we're showing here. So, for example, both in relative terms and absolute terms, the decline of expenditures have been much bigger at the federal level than at the provincial level. And actually, I have been showing in another paper with Eric Bélanger that the federal government has been able to increase its popularity when it cut back expenditures because the federal programs are not so popular. Whereas we could not imagine a situation of a provincial government cutting back on healthcare and education and not losing popularity. This is totally inconceivable. So the federal government is able to cut back expenditures. It's true, though, that the federal government had bigger debt and deficit than the provinces. So that may be an alternative hypothesis to explain why consolidation has been bigger at the federal level. They had more deficit. But still, I think that the nature of programs matter quite a lot. There are also unequal revenue constraints between the provinces and the federal level. So we know already from the fiscal federalism literature that the taxes on mobile factors, such as high-income people, corporation, and capital, are quite difficult to tax at the subnational level. And many studies have shown actually that if you increase top marginal tax rates, tax under 1%, at the provincial level, you don't waste so much revenues. The income elasticity is very large because people just move their cash to other provinces. It's much more difficult to move your corporation and move your cash in a different country. So the federal level is better able to increase corporate taxes, taxes on the rich, than the provinces. These taxes never really generate a lot of revenues, but they are quite popular. So a government that wants to increase its revenues a bit to face with fiscal pressures can increase taxes on the rich, taxes on corporation at the federal level, but not so much at the provincial level. So this is a revenue tool that doesn't exist in provinces' arsenal of taxation. And also, while transfers in Canada suffer from a particular political dynamic that make them particularly difficult to increase. We've seen stats today on the US where transfers to a state level has been increasing pretty much over the last 50 years, but in Canada they are decreasing. I think politically there is a clear reason that transfers to provinces are not increasing, because if Ottawa increased transfers, it's going to be blamed for the cost incurred by higher transfers. Ottawa is going to have to increase deficit, cut taxes,